Hey, Troy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Pete. It's good seeing you again.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think maybe the last time we caught up was a year ago, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the world has moved on quite a bit for you since then. You were doing one very cool climate startup back in the day. Now you're doing two. I'd like to ask about both of those, if that's okay.
So I run a company called EarthShot Labs, and EarthShot Labs is doing three things. The first is building a global open source ecological simulator to better understand how nature works. And once we understand how nature works and how to measure nature more accurately, we can incentivize policy, investment, and landowner decision making to actually help reverse some of the dramatic multiple systemic collapses in climate, in ecology, in biodiversity, and other areas. And
Mm.
that's really what Earthshot Labs is about. The name sort of says it all.
Yeah, and if on your website, which I think is earthshot.eco, is that right?
Correct.
You talk about some pretty big goals on there, like getting to a gigaton scale impact quite quickly. What, by 2030 was that? Is that still your?
Yeah.
Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah. So there's a common misunderstanding about what causes the climate crisis and also what the solution set is. And most of the attention and focus is on things like electric cars and decarbonizing energy in the built environment. And that's really important. We have to do that. But there's already a ton of money going into those areas. And actually, a more fundamental cause of the climate crisis is ecological collapse in biodiversity, in the health of forests, in deforestation, in ocean health, in soil health. And these are haven't gotten as much attention and mostly have gotten attention from philanthropy and nonprofits that have been doing this for a long time, but don't achieve the scale that sort of like modern investment and investable asset classes, like with really large amounts of money and a lot of sophisticated work. So
Mm.
Earthshot Labs is really taking on the role of providing the technology stack to incentivize humanity to scale up nature restoration in a way that we've never seen before.
So you say that this is not really in the public eye. Electric vehicles are in the public eye. Windmills are in the public eye. Wind turbines, but
Mhm.
nature not so much. I think trees are getting a lot of airtime, aren't they? So you're
For
seeing
sure.
a lot of action with trees, but it's so much more than that from what you're saying. Could you bring that to
Yeah.
life a little bit?
Yeah. So just on the subject of trees, trees are awesome. But the problem with trees is we're really good at planting trees and even nature itself is really good at planting trees. Actually, like most of these areas don't actually need human help. The problem is that we cut them down or that we go through land use changes by putting cattle on the land or developing the land. So actually most of the problem is that we continually degrade land versus just letting it go do its thing. And so it's really about the incentive structures, about paying people to conserve and manage land in a way that's in ecological harmony. And it's not so much just a one time thing. You plant the trees and then we're good. It's a much deeper, more nuanced view. And that's really why at EarthShot Labs, we're taking a very holistic approach. So, this ecological simulator, it's not just about trees, it's about trees and water and soil, and biodiversity. So, we can have a holistic way of measuring different land interventions. The second thing we're doing is okay, so it's great. We actually have all these awesome simulations, supercomputer level simulations with physics models and process based interventions for soil and water and forestry. So what? We've known these solutions for a long time. Like academics have built incredibly good models. Um, so what is we need to have everyone on Earth have access to this information and also have it in a way that's usable, but also where they get paid to do interventions, right? It's not enough just to give someone information and say, "Oh yeah, you should keep trees." Well, everyone knows that. Everyone knows that, there's no one out there that's like, "I hate trees, I'm just going to cut them down for the sake of it." Right? It's really about I get paid to cut down the trees. My livelihood depends on this activity, whether and my food security depends on the revenue I get from working at a logging company and many other scenarios across the world. So we need to change systemically the incentive structure. So that's what LandOS is about. It's what we're calling an operating system for land all over the world, and our app Biome, which is a way of taking measurements.
Can I ask about a couple of those things? So, I mean, first of all, you said everybody in the world. Do you mean everybody in the world, or do you mean certain types of people around the world? Are we talking about farmers, or are we literally talking about everybody?
Yeah, it's a good question. So everybody in the world is a pretty ambitious goal. So we have to start somewhere. And there's a specific use case for landowners, people who own land and whose land is degraded in some way, which turns out is most of land. Most land actually doesn't reach its ecological and financial potential. And so there are a couple use cases that are very high land, like deltas from land use change. One is, imagine tropical forests that have been cut down, that have very, very high biomass growth rates and very high, like, ecological fecundity, but don't allow a regrowth cycle because of cattle or soybeans or something like that. So we can pay indigenous peoples and agriculturalists and other peoples who own very degraded tropical land and do active reforestation. Another use case is avoided deforestation. So for all the tropical and temperate forests that are at risk of being cut down, we can pay people to be like, don't cut those trees down. It's worth your time. And anyway, there are so many ecosystem services that we can hardly value at the moment, whether that's carbon sequestration, but also just like water cycle balance and more subtle ecological interactions that science doesn't understand, like evapotranspiration cycles and actually like the nutrient flow between forests and grasslands and oceans and dust clouds. And albedo and heat reduction and things like that. So very, very complex interactions that we haven't learned to begin to measure. And a third scenario, for example, is take a place like Australia that is, for most of Australia or the Western US or Southern Europe, or parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, very arid landscapes that actually at one point were forests, but through human activity went through a desertification cycle or are going through a desertification cycle. So by removing cattle or moving to intensive grazing, by reintroducing vegetation, reintroducing low-tech terraforming based water interventions, we can restore entire landscape level water cycles.
So you mentioned that the example of Australia, which on the satellite map looks like it's almost entirely desert. Are you saying that there are areas around the edges that in the past weren't deserts, but actually most of Australia is supposed to be desert and has always been desert? Or do you mean that, we can, like the Sahara, the Gobi Desert, Australia, we can transform almost all of it back into rainforest?
Okay. Oh, there are deserts and there are deserts. So deserts are incredibly fecund, biodiverse ecosystems. Like just because they look dry doesn't mean there aren't billions of animals and maybe a human sees a scrubby landscape. These are incredibly rich ecosystems and they're highly fragile ecosystems. So by running 10,000 cattle on that land, hard compacting the soil, we do damage that we can't even see. And so just restoring landscapes into indigenous land management or just sort of non-human conservation is incredibly important in ways that we can hardly start to understand. And it turns out we have incentive structures where that activity can be profitable. By selling carbon credits and credits for other ecosystem services, we can actually make land restoration in arid areas, in deforested tropical areas and avoided deforestation. These areas can suddenly make conservation profitable. And that was not the case a few years ago.
Interesting. Can we come back to the incentives that you spoke about earlier? Because when I did a bit of work looking at the hidden sources of funding for deforestation. And I was trying to get to the bottom of why are people cutting down trees? It's so that they can have more cattle on that, grazing on that land, or so that they can grow soy, so that they can feed cattle elsewhere in the world. And the causes of that are because, man, we just love eating beef already, and we love eating chocolate, and so we need palm oil, we need cattle. Is there a way of achieving what you want to achieve without people like en masse just wholly stopping eating beef and palm oil?
That's a great question. I honestly don't know. I tend to think that there's a few different levels at which this change will happen. So the first is food systems need to become regionally autonomous, sort of permaculture, biodiverse, complex systems. And chances are this will cost more money, but produce a much, much higher quality product, right? When you go grow your own kale and, work with chickens in your own yard, feeding them scraps from the kitchen, like it tastes better. And the reason it tastes better is because it's like a nutritionally complete food that your body recognizes as having all the vitamins that otherwise you would buy 50 supplements for. So one is solving the food system at the level of individual behavior and village level behavior in developed countries. There's a shift in consciousness towards ecological consciousness, that we are part of a sort of Gaian organism that is supporting, a wide variety of life and beings. There's also on the systemic level, there's so okay, I'm gonna take a step back because we get pretty far out at this point. So I want to quote my friend Charles Eisenstein, who has a great framework for how change happens. The first level of change is and how to affect change. So you give a man a fish and he eats for a day. We're all familiar with that. Charity. And the second is you teach a man how to fish, and this level of empowerment. Okay, now he can go do it himself every day and provide for his family. The third level is systemic change, and this is most of what EarthShot deals with, is systemic change, which means starting asking the question, so why does this man have to work so hard to catch fish anyway? Why does he have to drive 30 miles and then use gasoline on his boat to an ocean that actually doesn't have, a tenth of the fish that it did 50 years ago, or a hundredth of the fish that it did 100 years ago, actually? And so these really systemic issues that actually have dramatic implications for everyone. And the fourth level of change is about narrative. What is the story of what it means to be a human being on Earth in this time? What is a human being anyway? What is the sense of self that causes us to affect these massive systemic changes like ecological collapse in multiple areas? And that is a level that EarthShot works on internally. So the way our company works, the way we communicate with each other, the way the cultural stand that we take as a company trickles down into systemic and individual landowner action, for example. So we work on the systems as part of the business. We work on the narrative as part of the company culture.
Yeah, I think that I can see how the narrative is super important, because you and I in our work and in our lives, we probably meet a lot of people who are sensitive not only to their own needs and the needs of their own community, but in communities around the world. And when they hear about overfishing in West Africa, for example, about boats sailing down from the EU to overfish in West Africa, sail back to the EU to sell that fish, then that's a lot of people are pretty pissed off about that in the EU. So they understand the narrative, and therefore they're thinking at this global scale. But I'd imagine that narrative is not globally distributed yet, and not everybody cares about the plight of this region of the world or that region of the world as much as they do about their own.
And not everyone has the luxury and privilege of being able to take into consideration global systemic changes. And if someone's food security is threatened and they need to go feed their family, guess what? working for a logging company, destroying their own forest is the best option available.
Yeah.
And so we need to be working at all these levels. It's not to prioritize the level of narrative and the shift in consciousness towards ecological Gaian consciousness. It's not just to say systemic shift is the only thing we need. It's actually working on all levels at the same time. It's just that charity and philanthropy are fairly well understood and well done. Systemic shift is an area where ecological work needs to move into to reach sort of like VC planetary scale, very well funded, very large amounts of money moving into nature restoration. And the narrative shift has to happen by the sort of conversations we're having right now, where we can identify what we believe in by talking about it, and where people listening can also self identify, like, yeah, that's what I feel too. Like, I feel that humans can be a key species in the ecological web of life. And we don't have to be a detriment to the ecosystem, that our function to create beauty and to interact with other species is an amazing function, and to move into becoming a multiplanetary species and other sort of future of humanity activities, like that's a really exciting, optimistic, amazing future. So if you believe that, like, let's go work together to actually make that happen, and forming coalition and allyship through shared mission and intention.
Yeah, very nice. So, in your on your website, you talk about having a gigaton scale impact. That's one way of it. You talk generally about success across multiple different metrics, but that's a very big metric in itself. That's one that I'm particularly interested in. How are you going to go about having a 1 billion ton scale impact?
Totally. And through a mechanized, or like decarbonizing the built environment or renewable energy, measuring a gigaton scale impact is pretty easy. So with nature, it's a much more complex story. And I also want to preface this by saying carbon is the least bad metric that we have for measuring impact. It's just the one that is a single number that means a lot in terms of global climate change that people are willing to pay for. But it doesn't represent the final outcome that we really want to optimize for, which is biodiverse, ecological harmony, humans living with regenerative livelihoods, social equity, etc. So, saying that, it's still important, and it's a useful metric. So 1 billion tons of CO2 drawdown isn't just an opportunity cost where we're saying we're moving from coal into solar, but solar still has a pretty big carbon impact in the creation of the actual materials itself. So how I'm prioritizing carbon removal is the physical removal of CO2 from the atmosphere into forests, soil, the built environment, or geological formation. And that is a very real accounting metric versus an opportunity cost metric, which is like offsetting other bad activities. And forests and photosynthesis do this really, really well. Turns out we've had billions of years of evolution to develop a highly efficient mechanism for turning sunlight into energy and carbon drawdown. So let's go use that technology. And we just need to let land do its thing, and it does it automatically and forms an incredible state of, if not like perfect equilibrium, at least like a band of equilibrium that's pretty suitable to human beings. And in order to do that, we need to do a few things to reach like gigaton scale impact. And this is millions of hectares of land that have been deforested, returning to native forest, with agroforestry that's useful for ongoing regenerative livelihoods for indigenous peoples or local peoples in that area. The second is restoring arid landscapes like Australia, South Europe, the Western US, and building landscape level interventions that are very low tech, including swales, check dams, shallow injection wells, to restore groundwater, to restore the local tiny water cycles on land that are really the foundation of life, the foundation of the possibility for photosynthesis to happen on that land. And another is avoided deforestation. So the tropical forests and temperate forests that we have, let's not cut those down. The temperate forests that are in relatively sustainable rotations for lumber, it's a trade-off, but it's sort of like we have to keep doing it because human beings need shelter, and maybe it's not the best outcome, but it's the one we're working with right now. Like EarthShot Labs, we're not recommending that human beings descale human activity because it's honestly just not a realistic recommendation. So we have to continue this sort of like economic engine that we're in, but in doing so, let's not destroy more.
So gigaton scale impact. I wonder, like, when you think about 2050, when we'll have pulled all of this off, and we'll have. I mean, there's two routes, right? There's the route where we go and crash the planet into the sun, and there's the other route where we pull it off and we fixed the problems that have, especially the climate problem that's facing us at the moment. I wonder if you've given any thought to what the world will look like then, because we'll have fixed not just that problem but many other systemic problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I have. I don't know that I can articulate the whole systemic picture right now because we don't know the whole systemic picture, but maybe just like articulating some of the feeling state that I'm in of like what we're aiming at. Because there will be 1,000 different technological and systemic initiatives over the coming 30 years. So some of the things that I'm aiming for. One is like a world where growth forests are totally normal. Another is where I know everyone that lives around me and that I have a deep network of intimate relationships that are incredibly meaningful. Another is that I don't have to work hard, like where I have to be stressed about making money to make a living, to pay for my house, to pay for my food, to pay for all these services so that I can keep like making a living to live so that I can then go to work, right? To have that cycle be a choice, right? To have work be a choice of creative possibilities versus an act to reduce stress, where temperatures and extreme weather events, like guess what, extreme weather events happen, like that's part of the natural flow of human systems. This is one of the most stable periods in the history of the planet, ecologically or like climatically. However, we're making that change. And so to re-enter into state of climate equilibrium where we can provide consistency for humans and for all other species to have time to adapt to whatever long-term climate changes happen. And that's at a much longer time scale. That's at the tens and hundreds of thousands of years rather than the tens of years that we're dealing with right now from human-caused climate change. To be in beautiful surroundings where when I go to town or when I go to a city, it's like, wow, this is a gorgeous city, where it's like there aren't cars running down the streets, where it's like there are garden parkways that are just as lush as the forest, and where I can remain in a highly sensitive state regardless of where I am. And where political polarity and divisiveness between people just feels obsolete, where we recognize that we are on this planet and doing this journey together, versus some of us are doing the right journey and some of us are doing the wrong journey, which is a common narrative that it just is not true. And then there are systemic changes around money, particularly financial and political systems that will have to change in order to reflect that felt sense of values that I described. And so there are many, many businesses that will emerge to reflect those values.
I do think we're living in an interesting time now that some of the best brains on the planet are reviewing what does money really mean, what is the role that it plays in society, and how can we do it all better? Where did it come from? How did it end up like this? What are the problems with it? How do we fix those problems? As I'm trying to devote my life to moving money away from things that harm and towards things that help, in particularly in the climate space. And over here, there's this whole like crypto blockchain experiment going on where people are reviewing these things. I think that's an interesting time to be alive. I also wonder. I keep running up against universal basic income, and I wonder whether that needs to be the thing. That needs to be like the foundation of this society that you describe.
I think universal basic income in general is a great idea, and that we should probably go implement it everywhere, and probably implement it some places first to see what sort of unintended consequences it brings that we haven't anticipated. Yeah, simple as that.
Crypto. Do you have hope that crypto will help us to come up with a form of economy that serves the greater good, and not just because at the moment we've invented this thing which is like a coagulant that kind of bundles up it lumps up all of the money in the world into big lumps in small places around the world, so it's not evenly distributed. Do you think this great crypto experiment has got any hope of us finding a fairer model?
Yes, I do. However, the way that it's done now, I haven't been super impressed with, because how I imagine value, and this is why I would say EarthShot Labs as a team, we haven't come to a strong thesis yet on what our work in crypto is. There's clearly something there, but we just don't know what it is yet, and we're in constant discussion to try to identify, because most blockchain-based projects do not provide fundamental value. They don't create wealth. What they can do is redistribute wealth and create liquidity and create speculation. But wealth is created by fundamental changes in physical reality, like by stuff changing, by trees being planted, by there being fresh, clean water access for your family. Like physical, and like the network of relationships that make you happy, like physical and relational changes that create more fulfillment. And I don't yet see crypto delivering on that promise as a whole. However, it has potential and can go in the right direction. But we need to bring a level of values about what we're optimizing for in this space. And what I see most is that there's sort of a shift of consciousness into abundance. This is sort of like a classic new age word, like, oh, abundance, like I'm in a state of abundance. But there's something very meaningful about a real abundance. And what I see in crypto is abundance is not more money. Abundance is the feeling that there's enough money. And so what I see in the crypto space right now is a lot of people getting a lot more money. And, same with me, like getting a lot more money, but it doesn't necessarily make it enough money. And so there's a bit of a counterintuitive feeling where with more and more crypto wealth being generated, it's still the same feeling of scarcity and the feeling of needing more, rather than like, actually, I have enough, which doesn't mean I can't make more, but I have plenty and I feel generous and I feel that I can be of service to the rest of the world because I have more than enough.
Yeah. I think there's like a hierarchy of needs here, isn't it? That you need to feel like you've got enough before you can be generous. Generosity springs from you can't be living hand to mouth and go out and cure world hunger. I don't believe. You need to feel like you know where the next meal's coming from. Do you disagree?
Yes, and I think it's more nuanced than that. I think generosity can reflect someone's inner state of abundance, and that life is more supportive than we can possibly imagine when we feel generous.
Can I talk about how you arrived here? What was the path from you left university maybe, and now you're talking about having a $1 billion ton impact. You're talking about mobilizing all of these people around the world to create this global map of the world. You're talking about creating $1 billion company, and you're well on your way to all of those three things. How did you get here?
So on a career level, I worked at different software companies in the Bay Area. After college, I went to Stanford. I started my own company, sold it after a couple years, and basically moved to Hawaii and hosted retreats with my wife for the last 7 years. And sort of started getting back into the entrepreneurial flow, recognizing the depth of ecological crisis that we are in and my responsibility or feeling of responsibility to go do something impactful in that space. Um, I helped start a company called Rhizome. We make bamboo engineered lumber and do reforestation throughout Southeast Asia. And then through that process, recognize that there's an even larger level of impact that I wanted to have on technological systems and incentive structures that underlie the specific climate solutions that companies like Rhizome represent, which is decarbonizing the built environment and doing carbon project development. And so EarthShot is sort of a culmination of those lessons, sort of this, spiritual, relational nature journey that I had for these 7 years on Hawaii, and also the entrepreneurial and finance and, carbon development and project development background through Rhizome and earlier companies. And that's also the bridge that we're building as a company. So EarthShot Labs is bringing together a team of people with a lot of rigor and intelligence and competence and deep expertise, like really world-class expertise in finance, in project development, in software development, machine learning, ecological modeling, like really, really world-class teams, but who also want to participate in a way of doing that is coherent with that sort of like cultural end state that we talked about in 2050, where it's really like we love each other and we are doing this together and share a common mission and are doing this out of a love for nature. And that is a combination that I don't see represented in any or many companies, at least. And so that is something that I hope will have as much impact as carbon drawdown, which is creating a standard for business that reflects the values that we actually hold.
So I'm trying to waft the flames of entrepreneurship. I go around to universities and I speak to final year students and say, listen, I know you're tempted to go and work at KPMG straight after this and do spreadsheets. Don't do that. Go and do a startup. I don't know if you've got any advice about what areas they should go and get into. If I can provide you with 1,000 new entrepreneurs, what problems would you have them go and attack?
First, maybe we can hire them. Second is, okay, if people want to, I'm not very good at giving advice, and I don't think advice is super useful, but I'm going to do it anyway, just for the sake of this show. So one is choose something that you really care about, not just that you think you care about, but that you viscerally care about. So like when I'm in an old growth forest, I'm like, this is what life is about, right? Like this is something that I could be motivated my entire life. It won't die out. And so choose something that you can be motivated your whole life about, that you would be willing to that you feel is a deep purpose for your being in this lifetime. The second is the bigger the problem, the easier it is to solve. So like trying to solve a little problem is like, so, I think of a little problem as like someone making an iteratively better ad distribution system, right? It's like, okay, it won't attract, and same with like doing something that you really care about. It won't attract a team that is also deeply committed, because the bigger the problem, the more opportunities for using your intelligence where you can have real impact. I remember this one story. One of the people we're working with, he was working at Google and developed this amazing AI system. And it turned out that the only use case for it, or the thing that Google ended up using it for, was like recipe recommendations. And he was like, I don't care about doing better recipe recommendations. I wanted to change the world in a really fundamental, systemic way. And so he left. And so ecological crisis and climate change, or the climate crisis, are themes that will have longevity, unfortunately. There are huge problems that you can spend your entire life working on and not get to the end. And that there are problems that touch into the human moral framework and love for nature that also won't die. And so I believe that this is one of the biggest areas. If you want to start a company in climate. Obviously, there are other areas. The realm of human relationships and the expansion of human consciousness, the financial systems and monetary systems that reflect the world we want to live in. Like, there are many areas that are big problems, and sort of expansion of human consciousness. I'm also thinking of like mental health, and also like the way we work and the way we live and the structures that we live in. Like, these are big areas that if you feel a passion, like, yeah, I want to transform cities, like, you can run with that for 50 years and you'll be happy.
Yeah, great. So people who love the sound of what you've been talking about and want to hear more, what should they do?
So easiest way is go to earthshot.eco if you want to engage with EarthShot as a company or our team. You can join the Slack channel, which is a community of 1,500 people or so right now, and participate in all the work that we're doing on an open source and volunteer basis. If you're an investor or landowner, or you're at a sovereign wealth fund or something like that, or you're at a large corporate that is looking at buying carbon credits or supporting ecological projects, give us a call. We're building out a really significant demand ledger for carbon credits right now. And we're also building out the supply side, which means world-class reforestation and land restoration projects. If you're a bank or represent a commercial debt, also give us a call. Our audacious goal right now is to go raise $1 billion over the next 6 months to go do land restoration.
I thought you were going to say over the next 60 years. Not 60 years, 6 months.
No, so it's September 27th, 2021. I'm going to check in 6 months to see if we actually did that. I actually think it's pretty realistic. There's a compelling financial reason and ecological reason to go do land restoration that has not existed before. Like, the financial mechanism for doing that large scale of land restoration hasn't existed until now. And now we have the technology to do land sourcing and intervention and project planning in a way that also has never existed, that we're developing. And the carbon market has matured so much in the past 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, that there's actually a clear mechanism for going and buying 10 million hectares of land in Australia a very profitable operation and putting it into conservation and under Indigenous land management.
Yeah, well, I think we're out of time. But listen, Troy, every time I speak to you, it's such an uplifting and inspirational time. So I hope to get to speak to you again in a year and see what you're up to. But thanks so much for joining us. It's been really great.
Thanks so much, Pete. It was really sweet to be on this, and we've had a fairly sporadic, casual relationship over the past couple years, and it's great just seeing. And maybe this is a shout out also to the people listening right now. Like, there are a lot of people that care, And sometimes we underestimate how much other people care and how much we are actually allies. And so just recognizing you, Pete, as an ally, that we're going to be doing this for the next 50 years and it's going to be fun. And we're going to have a dramatic level of impact that we can hardly imagine at this point. And so, hey, anyone out there listening, you want to join the party? Let's chat.
Troy Carter, EarthShot Labs. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.